But joining me first for the first 15 or 20 minutes or so is Paul Embery, who's a writer and trade unionist, but is a pro-Brexit campaigner, so hopefully we'll get on fine. An author of Despised, Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. Paul, can we talk about that very quickly? In Précis, why do the modern left loathe the working class, mate?
Because I think the left has changed pretty fundamentally over the last 30 years. The left was once from the working class, but increasingly I think the left became representative of what you might call the professional and managerial classes.
The elite.
It became very kind of London-centric. It saw the world from within the M25 or from the vantage point of their places in the fashionable cities and university towns. And not only did they not share the priorities of the working class increasingly, but they came to dislike the working class and treat them almost as if they were some sort of embarrassing elderly relative. Probably the best example was the Gillian Duffy incident during the 2010 election, when all this woman did, you know, a traditional Labour supporter, was to raise concerns with the Labour Prime Minister over the levels of immigration into her community, and she was regarded as a bigoted old woman.
Well, Gordon Brown specifically called her, didn't he, on a hot mic, a bigoted old woman. And when did that happen, do you think? 1997, with the advent of Blair and Brown? Do you think that's when this kind of pomposity of intellectual leftism happened and left kind of old school lefties, maybe like you, Paul, behind?
I think it was a bit before that. I think you can probably trace it to about the late 1980s, when, if you like, the 1968 generation, the revolutionaries in the universities came of age and really began putting their stamp on public life and inside the Labour movement. And I think the Labour Party itself began to change around that time. It had always been traditionally, at its best, it had been a coalition between Hampstead and Hartlepool. Yep. So, you know, Hartlepool being the working class blue collar element, Hampstead being the more middle class, the liberal intelligentsia, if you like. And it's always needed that second part of the coalition.
And Paul, that brings us nicely to the question of Brexit, of course, doesn't it? Because, you know, Brexit, in terms of the 52% that voted to leave in 2016, as you know, maybe from my intro, of course, we are celebrating the 5th birthday, the 5th anniversary of actually leaving the EU today, 31st of January. That was, I think, a coalition, wasn't it? Because lots and lots of old school Labour supporters decided and voted to Brexit, to leave. Do you think we actually have? Do you think Brexit has happened? Do you think we have Brexited?
Well, I think technically we have, but I look at it almost as if the political class in this country were kind of given a gift almost for Christmas, a bit like when you're given a gift for Christmas and you don't really want it, you don't really know what to do with it, so you end up sticking it in the loft. And only really mentioning it or bringing it out when the people who gave you the gift come round and ask you about it. And that's been the problem, really, that what the public voted for, and it was driven largely by the working class, as you touch on. I mean, 2/3 of Labour constituencies voted Leave, for example, and that helped to, if you like, widen the chasm between the Labour Party and the working class.
Although, Paul, very interestingly, if I just interrupt you for a second, the Labour MPs for those constituencies, of course, didn't. So talk about being out of touch with your electorate.
Overwhelmingly, people within the Labour Party and the wider Labour movement, the trade unions, were pro-Remain, and I was almost like a museum piece in there. I've been a member of the Labour Party for 30 odd years and an active trade unionist, and there were a small group of us who were pro-Brexit, but we were treated almost as museum pieces. But interestingly, and you'll know this yourself, there is actually historically a very rich thread of Euroscepticism within the Labour Party. I mean, if you look at the Common Market referendum in 1975, a huge number of Labour MPs voted no to the common market. A majority of trade unions voted no to the common market. Back in those days, Labour MPs and trade unions believed in democracy. They believed in self-government. They understood that the common market, what became the EU, was very much a sort of, if you like, a capitalist club. But we lost our intellectual self-confidence on the left, and we thought that actually we can't really do these things ourselves now as a country. We need a European...
Well, we need to lean into the EU, which of course course, is a travesty of an organisation. I mean, it's not democratic. It's got a terrible record when it comes to its own approach and polity to immigration. I mean, look at the state of Germany, look at the state of Italy, or prior to the current Prime Minister, of course, the state of Greece. I mean, it's a failed project economically, financially, commercially, and certainly when it comes to immigration and so on. So quite why we would want to lean into it. I mean, if you look at the GDP now, I mean, many people this morning, by the way, saying, look at the state of Britain. We would be far better off if we'd stayed in the EU. And of course, up until Labour took power 7 months ago, our economy was the fastest growing economy in the G7. So inflation was down, interest rates were being cut, GDP was increasing. And of course, in the last 3 or 4 months under Rachel Reeves, we've now seen a decline. So our economy is now shrinking, but so is France's, and so is Germany's. So this nonsense that we're hearing from the commentariat, that financially and economically we will be far, far better off, continue to pay £29 billion net to the EU. I mean, it's for the birds, Paul, isn't it?
Well, I never believed that the EU delivered anything like the benefits that its supporters contended for it. And from a left point of view, I mean, I don't share, for example, the vision of Nigel Farage. I'm on the left. I don't want to see the rolling back of the frontiers of the state. I don't want to see a Singapore-on-Thames kind of post-Brexit model. I believe if
you don't want to see low tax zones to inspire wealth and growth.
Well, I believe in using the power of the state to deliver growth. I believe in a government that intervenes. I think if you look at the legacy, for example, of the rolling back the frontiers of the state philosophy in the 1980s and look at what it did in Britain in terms of the Thatcherite approach and much of the kind of deindustrialization that we saw, some of the communities that suffered from that, mining communities, which are still paying the price of that today. I think the mood has shifted. I think that people, particularly working class people, don't want an overbearing state, of course, but nonetheless, they don't want a state that doesn't take an interest in their lives, that doesn't intervene.
Paul, I think you and I could talk all day long about the perils of the state being too big, particularly relying on the state to grow an economy, because how's that going so far under Rachel Reeves? But anyway, I don't want to talk about that right now because we've got a few minutes left, and I want to talk about more the politics of Brexit, and particularly here's another question for you. Being on the left, it's widely believed, even by those on the left, that Keir Starmer wants to take us back into the EU, even if it doesn't get labelled as such. It is very, very clear, and I think he's in Brussels on Monday, funnily enough. It is very, very clear, isn't it, that Keir Starmer wants to take us back into the EU by stealth?
Well, he would need to be really very careful because he's made a promise that we won't be returning to the European Union on his watch. And people are not stupid. If they think that we are essentially going back into the EU in everything but name, then I think people are going to sniff that out. And the Labour Party, having worked pretty hard, not necessarily been successful, but worked pretty hard in trying to reconnect with some of those red wall constituencies over the last couple of years, it would just blow all of that away again. Now, I think that I don't think people necessarily want an isolationist Britain. I think people generally are happy to work with our EU partners, but what we don't want is an EU parliament that tells our parliament what to do. What we don't want is a web of treaties and directives that govern our lives and from which it's very difficult to escape. And if Starmer starts going down that road, then I think he's going to alienate millions of people.
But no, I agree, and that some would say that actually closer alignment in terms of trade, actually the common market, which of course is what the liaison, the cooperation between us and Europe was supposed to be all about when it was introduced in the 1970s. Trade agreements, a common market, is fine, but the problem is in their quest for the federalisation of Europe, whereby we end up with the EU telling Europe what to do, even though they generally have no elected and democratic mandate to do so. They have insisted that, for instance, if we want to have free trade with them and trade agreements, that we also have to accept the premise of free movement. And of course, in this country right now, as it is, we have enough of an immigration problem without then also opening the gates to Europe, as well as the gates to Syria, Afghanistan, India and Vietnam as we have. So I'm afraid the EU are really the problem. It's not the problem of Britain not wanting liaison and closer ties with the EU. It's the conditions that the EU put on those wants and needs.
Well, a return So free movement, I think, would be disastrous, not just for the Labour Party, but for the wider country. We know that millions of people voted the way they did in the Brexit referendum because of free movement, not because they are bigoted, not because they're nativists, but because they saw that actually numbers were too high and becoming unmanageable. It was having an impact on community cohesion. It was having an impact on wages in certain sectors. And I'm that rare thing in the Labour movement. I believe in regulation of the labour supply. Once upon a time, people in the Labour Party understood you had to control the labour supply so as to give the government the best opportunity to plan around welfare and housing and jobs and so on. The open borders philosophy was largely the preserve of people on the far left, Trotskyists and anarchists and so on. But that's now reversed the other way, and it's people like me who believe in control of the labour supply who are seen almost as the cranks. But I would say that actually the mainstream view out there is we do not want open borders. We're in favour generally of immigration if it's managed and if numbers are modest.
Well, and if it's selective. And the problem is now, because of Tony Blair's insistence on wrapping the UK into the ECHR, and he did that by way of the Human Rights Act in 1998, we end up now allowing effectively everybody in, no matter what. So there's no more selective immigration, so it's not engineers, plumbers and doctors, it's a free-for-all. And of course we can't get rid of them. Paul, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. But look, really appreciate your the conversation with you and your insight. I'm sure you'll be back soon. That's Paul Embery, writer and trade unionist, believe it or not. But we didn't disagree on much there. I suspect we would have done if we'd delved into state versus private sector and who is responsible for growth, because it's very much the latter, in my opinion.